Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I am absolutely thrilled today because we have a long overdue guest, and that's Gerry Zack. Gerry, first of all, welcome to the podcast, and I have to say it's been way overdue.
Thanks so much, Tom. And yeah, I'm excited to kind of be back. You and I did a podcast, I don't know, a few years ago. And then since I left SCCE, I've been sort of lying low and trying to decide what my next moves are. It's great to kind of reemerge, if you will, with your podcast.
We don't often have sort of current news. We have current events on this pod, but why don't you tell our audience where you are and what you're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, I am in Paris. And for the past 2 days, I've been at the big OECD conference, the Global Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum. They have it every year. It is kind of a meeting of both the governmental folks and people from civil society and private sector to talk about what's going on in the area of corruption. And of course, there's nothing going on now with anti-corruption. But yeah, needless to say, there was a lot to talk about. Some very interesting presentations. As usual, some sessions that you get more out of than others. But it was a well-spent couple of days, and I'm excited to talk about it with you.
Why don't you talk to us a little bit maybe about the structure of the event? Is it a typical conference with a keynote or two and then breakout sessions? How is it structured, and how have you thought through some of the topics we can visit about today?
Good question. It's not your traditional conference. There technically are one or two keynotes, but they're very short. They tend to be a quick statement. The president of the Republic of Guatemala made a statement at the beginning about the importance of anti-corruption efforts and things. Most of the sessions are panel discussions, and typically the moderator is an OECD person, kind of maybe a chair of one of the working group or some other capacity dealing with anti-corruption. So you'll have an OECD moderator typically, not always, there's some non-OECD moderators, but most seem to be OECD moderators. And then the panelists themselves come from, again, that similar kind of a cross-section of some government folks, some private sector folks, some civil society, several NGOs that are represented, groups like Transparency International, folks like that. And they had a nice agenda that kind of walked around through some of the current developments, what's changing in the landscape. There were quite a few veiled and unveiled references to what's going on in the U.S., of course, and we'll get to those in due time. But yeah, it was a good conference. I thought that the recurring theme seemed to revolve around what companies and compliance officers need to do right now, both in reaction to what's going on in the U.S. in terms of the pause and FCPA enforcement and things, but also just more broadly, just what things are important to compliance officers and companies. There were some good takeaways on what governments can do to help in the effort to combat corruption. I thought that there were some very useful moments when they talked about, it's interesting because there was a conversation about incentives, but it really was more about showing the value of compliance. And there were some good ideas, some good takeaways there that we can talk about. And then there's the sort of the requisite discussion on technology and artificial intelligence and things, some of which was nothing new, but some very good insights there as well. The overall theme of the conference this year was innovation. So that fit in nicely. There was kind of a recurring theme there of using technology and innovating.
I probably should have started with this, but my Gen Z daughter reminds me it's always about the vibe. So how would you characterize the vibe? Was it, we are crazy in America? Was it, this is maybe a change, maybe a lot of change, but change is what happens, or maybe even something different?
Yep, it's a good question because I didn't pick up a lot of vibe of we're a bunch of crazy people in America. I think that the shock is already over, if there was shock there. Some consternation, some confusion, like what's coming next. And as I would say, who knows what's coming next? It's the vibe is that they've accepted that we've entered this era where it's going to be rather turbulent, a lot of change going on, changes in U.S. policy and approaches to things to go along with many of the other changes that we are already facing in compliance and ethics. But yet a little bit of anger I sensed from a couple of the attendees, more so than speakers, a couple of people with some angry questions. How are we going to deal with this craziness that's going on in the United States? And a sense of being let down quite a bit by the United States. But by the same token, kind of a positive vibe in that the European community and beyond, but particularly European community, is up for the challenge. They recognize it's going to be turbulent, but they're very much up for the challenge, and they think that they will get through this just fine with or without U.S. support. I get the sense that in the end, this could end up making everyone stronger.
The programs, or let me maybe start with compliance programs themselves. And certainly myself and others talked about our first response to the executive order was, hey guys, the law's still the law. There's laws outside the United States that you have to comply with, Bribery Act, CEP, Clean Companies Act in Brazil, and a variety of other laws, so that what you have to do as a compliance officer and as a compliance function really may not change that much. How did you see, or what did they talk about in terms of the executive order or other changes might affect compliance programs as opposed to enforcement?
Yeah, good. It's interesting because it was kind of queued up by there's a couple folks from Transparency International, including the chair, Francois Valeria, and he kind of without naming names, he basically went through what's going on in terms of pausing enforcement and getting rid of inspectors general and several of the other things, and then concluded that this does not create jobs. It was basically, didn't pull any punches. This does not create jobs. It only creates more investment in the secondary economy, in the secondary market through bribery and corruption. So that really queued things up for then the compliance part of the discussion. And the compliance part of the discussion was very similar to what you're saying, is that there's this acknowledgement that, yes, there's a pause in the U.S., but there's also a statute of limitations in the U.S., and the law itself, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, is still on the books, of course. So you've got a pause. We'll see where it goes after the 180 days. But nonetheless, between all the multinational and all the other laws on the books in other countries, coupled then with this pause without getting rid of the law itself and a statute of limitations, the sense being that the vast majority of American companies and other companies aren't going to suddenly say, let's go start paying a bunch of bribes, that there's still going to be this value placed on maintaining a compliance program. So that from a day-to-day standpoint, most of what goes into a compliance and ethics program doesn't really change a whole lot for compliance professionals, compliance officers. But they did, I think it was one of the other gentlemen from Transparency International, the CEO, Mara Martini. I think he was the one that pointed out that one thing that probably does change is there's the demand side of the equation. And basically saying, hey, compliance people, you should be aware that the likelihood of people asking for bribes is going to go up when you're working outside of the United States, because the perception is that, well, with no enforcement, these American companies can now afford to pay us bribes. So while on the surface, it doesn't impact our compliance programs because of all the reasons we just mentioned, one thing I think compliance professionals need to be prepared for is reinforcing and training and giving resources and tools to our people who are out in the field, saying, hey, you're more apt than ever to maybe get solicited for a bribe. The demand side of this might change. That's the part that's more apt to change than the supply side. So I thought that was very good, useful advice coming from the group that discussed that.
Gerry, the announcement last week joint announcement by France, Britain, and Switzerland of a joint task force to combat corruption had to have been part of the conversation. But I really wanted to use that to introduce the broader topic of what were the conversations around how other governments might respond to the U.S. announcement.
Yeah, the word collective action, or the term collective action, was used quite a bit, and collaboration, and the thinking being that, yes, other governments need to step up. And they had a few different ideas, which I'll get to in just a second. But as you pointed out, one of the topics of discussion was the agreement. And one of my local colleagues here, Maria Lancret, who's a compliance attorney here in Paris with the Squire law firm, she gave me a wonderful update on it. And as you said, it's the UK, it's Switzerland, and France. And from what Maria was telling me, the prosecutors really were already working jointly on transnational cases in a more informal way from these three jurisdictions. But now that they've signed this, what they call a founding statement that reinforces that commitment, They're going to be establishing a prosecutorial task force, which will continue this judicial collaboration on individual cases and to work on an international strategy for combating corruption. As Maria pointed out, it's kind of interesting that each of these three countries have pretty long-arm statutes. So their ability to prosecute crimes outside of those three countries is rather extensive. We always talk about the FCPA having a kind of a long arm, the UK Anti-Bribery Act, and the Sapando in France. These also have pretty long arms to them. So the sense being that this will be the start of a bigger trend, most likely. There'll be more signs of collaboration, cooperation between countries not named the United States of America in terms of going after this. There were a couple other things that came up repeatedly in this discussion of what governments can do. There's a general acknowledgement of a need to simplify a lot of the rules and regulations. Not a lot of meat on that discussion yet, more just like an acknowledgement that we need to simplify. And then maybe the more important part is we need more harmonization between countries in terms of how they approach even just definitions of bribery. Some of the most basic things, there's a lack of harmony from country to country. So the overall kind of sense is simplification, harmonization, and then there was a lot of talk about cost-benefit analysis of regulation, something that we've heard here in the United States, of course, that the cost to business of a law or a regulation is sometimes exorbitant. And I think with the CSRD rollback that's taking place in Europe right now, I think this is very fresh on a lot of minds of European folks. To a person, everyone I spoke with about the CSRD said, yeah, they need to get rid of it or they need to scale it way back. It's just way, way too complicated. And that's it. Actually, the CSRD rules create risks of corruption as well, the way they've set them up. But back to the anti-bribery and anti-corruption area, yeah, there's a lot of push towards cost-benefit analysis. Evidently, the European Commission or one of the EU agencies, I don't think they even named which specific agency, but a group that worked with the government in Portugal to develop a system for analyzing what the costs of new rulemaking would be, what the effects of new rulemaking would be. So some sort of cutting edge kind of work going on in that space.
Sure. Would that harmonization be something like the United Kingdom not allowing facilitation payments? Certainly that's allowed in the United States, but other countries may have laws one way or the other. Is it that type of harmonization? Is it a harmonization of sharing information through multilateral legal treaties or obtaining evidence or witnesses, interviews, depositions, that sort of thing, or all of the above or none of the above?
It really is a little bit of all the above, but most of the discussion surrounded harmonization on the rules themselves so that, what the rule book, what the compliance officer needs to be concerned with in one country is not dramatically different from what it is in the country right next door to it. So it's that kind of harmonization. But like you said, they also did make reference to increased cooperation and the mutual assistance types of arrangements.
What about in the area of incentives? Was this incentives for companies to self-report or self-disclose, or was this more internal focused incentives around incentivizing employees to do business ethically and in compliance?
That's a good question because I saw incentives showing up in some of the session descriptions, but it wasn't the kind of incentives that I was thinking of. Oh, the employee of the month kind of incentive, or those kinds of incentives where people get recognition for doing something. It's interesting because it was all about creating a broader company-wide interest in placing value on the compliance program. One of the very interesting discussions, there were two discussions I'll make reference to. One was, it was queued up by an attorney, what's her name, Nana Frembor from DLA Piper. She did, in response to a question, I believe, she talked about what sectors, someone asked her the question, what sectors have done a good job of proving the value or showing the value of compliance? And she did mention healthcare. She said, well, you've got lots of small incremental transactions, but it's really important. I'm going to come back to this in a second, but it's really important that patients have trust and that there's a trust factor element to it. So that's recognized as being a value in the healthcare. And then the other example she gave was one I hadn't really thought of, but she was so spot on. Private equity firms invest in compliance to make a profit off the company. They say if we can keep the company out of trouble while we own it, it's going to improve what we can sell this thing for in 2 years or 4 years or whatever the window is. And I started thinking about that. And I thought, okay, if private equity firm, we're all private equity, right? It's like when I invest in a stock or a mutual fund, I'm a private citizen providing equity. It's just that it's not as material to the company as your typical private equity firm. How can we establish that same sort of mentality with shareholders? Of saying, hey, you should be looking for companies that place value. That was what was bouncing through my mind after she made that analogy to private equity firms. If it's important to that kind of a shareholder, how do we take that same logic and apply it to less material types of shareholders? So it's something so maybe we're approaching this in the wrong way when we talk about selling senior management on compliance. Maybe we need to be trying to sell it more to the shareholders and whoever owns the company, even privately held companies.
That's a great insight, because I have articulated that particularly with PE firms, they may not be able to access the cash in their own business if they don't have a compliance program along the lines of, you can't sell it, you can't get a loan, you can't sell part of an interest, you can't take an IPO, et cetera. But this actually puts a positive spin on it and says, we are delivering value to you, Mr. or Mrs. Shareholder, through the implementation of a best practice compliance program. We are not talking about that nearly enough. That's great.
Yeah, I thought I wrote that one in capital letters. That was a nugget that paid the whole if that was the only thing I got out of this conference, so that was useful. It's like, how do we take that same sort of mindset of, this is an investment, and if we have a good compliance program, I make more money, because when I go ahead and sell this company, people are going to pay a premium for it. So
we got to find a PE guy who'd say that on air.
Yeah, exactly. I'll help look for one. I know of a couple who might be able to work on that. We'll work on that one. But another one that's really interesting, Tom. This is really fascinating. They got into this issue of building trust, and trust to the stakeholders, and how valuable trust is. And a gentleman, Hans Vad Hansen, is the Chief Trust and Compliance Officer for IBM. Not the Chief Compliance Officer, Chief Trust and Compliance Officer. And he tells the story of how AI in products, companies using AI, has created a new concern by customers of, can I trust this? This is unlike other things that I bought. This now has AI in it. I'm not sure if I trust it. And Hans worked, and what happened is that the salespeople were coming to compliance saying, how do we convince people? Because no one knew the technical side of it. They didn't want to talk to the technical people and say, okay, here's how it works, customer. Amazingly, compliance is involved in the sales process now by building trust. It's saying, we have a compliance program built around artificial intelligence. That one also got me thinking. I was thinking, okay, it's like we have trust in healthcare, and that creates a need for compliance there. But now we need trust in this unusual technology. Now, most of the companies that you and I speak with aren't the IBMs of the world. They're not selling AI applications, but they're using AI. And maybe that's part of the key to say, hey, customers, we use AI, it makes us more efficient and all that, but we've got a compliance program around AI. So it adds value to the company by building that trust with the customers. So I thought that's another one, just like the whole value that the private equity people assign to it. I thought this whole idea of figuring out the link to trust is another very potentially useful tool, really, for compliance professionals to consider.
That is. We talk about trust, but we talk about it in a very different way, which is essentially, do the employees trust management if they raise their hand and speak up, something like that, and to be fair and have some institutional justice. But once again, great insight. I suppose that data, AI, technology, data analytics were also some part of the conversation. What did you hear around that?
Yeah, it was interesting, because one of these sessions on data analytics and things I thought was not very practical. It was just a lot of fluff. But there was another session that was useful. Again, the gentleman from IBM was there, a gentleman named Mark Nightingale, who is with one of these consortiums of journalists. He had some good insight into it, as well as some utilization. He was one of the few that I've heard now mention what they use. They have got now a tool, they developed a tool where they extract unstructured data, so free text of things, but arrange it in a structured manner. So it puts it into a structured format. And again, he didn't have time to go into enough details and examples of it, but it could be anything from sentence structure to saying, here's the verb, here's the noun, here's the subject, all this sort of stuff, and putting it into those sorts of fields, kind of a structured environment to then be able to do better analytics on it. So going from just looking for keywords to looking at sentence structure and things like this and breaking it down and using artificial intelligence to really do this well. So that was one very interesting application of analytics and artificial intelligence. The gentleman from IBM had another nice example that in addition to your typical chat GPT versions for compliance programs, which are useful, a couple examples of that, but he had another interesting one in terms of in using artificial intelligence in connection with the commencing of investigations that based upon an allegation, artificial intelligence is used to develop the initial plan for the investigator, including who should I interview and in what order should I interview them in that could be relevant to this particular allegation. And obviously, the more information one has in the allegations, it's the better. That's no different whether you're a human or artificial intelligence being used. But I thought that's a fascinating use of it because we've talked before about using artificial intelligence to write reports, to answer questions from people that have questions about compliance. But this was a different application that I hadn't run across before of a basic artificial intelligence saying, based on this allegation, you should talk to these three people and ask these kinds of, even can get into helping to plan out what you would ask each one of them. So I thought that was a fascinating use of technology. Let's see. And the other points were more just, I think, nothing that earth-shattering. Increased use of data analytics and risk assessments. One person did point out something I think several of us have maybe mentioned this before, but it was nice to hear it used in this manner of using detected frauds and detected compliance failures and sort of deconstructing them to make a preventive control out of it using the analytics, basically saying, here's how it happened. We detected it. That's good. We detected it, but it did still happen. So is there a way of shifting? I sometimes use this timeline when I'm talking about data analytics. Can we shift that earlier so that instead of it being detected, we actually now can figure out a way of preventing it? So sort of deconstruct exactly how it did happen and back into then the analytics that can prevent.
Would that be close or akin to a root cause analysis?
Yeah, it could be part of the root cause analysis. Absolutely. It should be part of the outgrowth of a root cause analysis of saying, what can we do about it going forward? Either from, obviously, root cause analysis sometimes means changing of internal controls, but could also mean I can accelerate the analytics earlier in the system. I can figure out a way to detect this before it's actually, or while it's in process.
Let me circle back to kind of where we started as we move towards the end of this episode, Gerry, I'm sorry. I called it the vibe, but it seemed what you said was it was almost measured in how their response was, that the shock and awe is no longer there. And yes, there's change. And how do you react, or what's your resiliency around this change? What can we suggest to maybe make things better or respond to those changes? And almost a business as usual response.
Yeah, I think that's what it is, with a couple exceptions. Like I said, the only anger, craziness kind of that I sensed was from a couple of the people in the audience who got to ask questions. One person talking about the effect on climate change and Europe's green transition as a result of all of this, because there's a lot of potential for corruption there. And actually, one of the areas where the conference I think was useful for me is we have this tendency to get stuck in the FCPA rut of thinking about corruption only from the standpoint of bribes being paid to get business. And they had a lot of discussion about other types of corruption. They even had a whole session on what they call strategic corruption. It could be anything from election meddling to conflicts of interest, as some of the other areas where there's no bribe whatsoever, but there's very damaging types of corruption taking place. But the one on the green transition opened my eyes in terms of the sheer volume of different manners with which corruption does take place in that sector, the mining sector, and everything from on the ground in places to, again, getting permits for mines to all the way up to bribes and other corruption involving the reporting of sustainability matters and things of that nature. Just really a lot of potential risk in that area that was discussed.
This has been just a delightful episode. And I really wanted to thank you for reaching out and offering to do this. We don't get these sort of in-depth reports, particularly from the OECD meetings, nearly as much as we should. So I'm not sure how I can encourage you to keep doing this, but keep doing this.
Whenever I can, I will, because I enjoyed it too. Like you said, it's been too long for us. I've always enjoyed talking with you, so we'll make this maybe a more regular thing because, yeah, I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed talking with you, and this one seemed like a very pertinent one to talk about because, yeah, it's a very interesting conference and right on the heels of all the stuff going on in the U.S.
Gerry, before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you or find out any more information in detail about the matters we talked about. What might be the best place for them to go or way for them to do so?
Probably either of two ways. One is I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. Just look for Gerry Zack on LinkedIn. But if you just want to directly email me, just Gerry with a G, Gerry at risk-trek, so risktrek.com. You can just email me directly on that as well. But happy to chat with people, happy to answer any follow-up questions anyone has.
Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Now, thank you, Tom. It was a pleasure. Take care.